Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bet of Echai. Please switch off your mobile devices. I feel privileged to invite Professor Gafni, who is an emeritus professor at Hebrew U. Professor Gafni's main field of research stretches from the Second Temple period through Jewish history to Mishnaic and Talmudic period. Today's lecture is the first of 4 lectures concerning Jerusalem and the temple in it. As a former student of Professor Gafni, I'm very privileged to invite him. Please.
As a former student, I would ask you not to preempt things you may have heard, I don't know how many years ago, although I don't think I ever taught this particular issue. Good evening. I don't know if I should be happy or not that we moved into this very intimate setting. I would have preferred the other setting where one feels in a classroom and in a classroom atmosphere rather than just presenting. You probably guessed that all 4 of our lectures today and the next 3 deal with Jerusalem because it's that time of the year. Beginning already next Sunday, the first of 2 fasts commemorating the destruction of the war leading to the destruction of the temple, the Shiva Asar B'Tammuz Sunday, and 3 weeks later, Tisha B'Av. And so we chose to dedicate these lectures to aspects of Jerusalem, the temple, the destruction of the temple, and the last lecture will deal with the immediate aftermath of the destruction. Today's session, however, really requires some explanation. Pre-Histories of Jerusalem. What do I mean by that? If you read the Bible, anyone reading the Bible would know precious little about Jerusalem before the days of David and Solomon. In fact, if you believe certain archaeologists, in particular those who teach in Tel Aviv, right, you probably wouldn't know very much about Jerusalem even in the days of David and Solomon, assuming they existed according to that particular school of archaeologists. I won't get into that debate. But the fact is that the precious little that we do know about Jerusalem before David arrives on the scene stresses that in fact the city is not in Jewish hands. It is not considered a city of Israel. Joshua, we are told at the very beginning, chapter 10 of the book of Joshua, defeated and executed Adoni-Tzedek, the king of Jerusalem. Following Joshua's death, the Judeans fought against the city, set the city on fire, and it remained outside of Jewish history. It was considered, quote, I'm quoting now Judges chapter 19, a city of the Jebusites, or again in Judges 19, a city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel. In other words, the Bible itself tells us that Jerusalem is beyond the Jewish or Israelite framework until we get to the days of David. And the situation changes under David, and there are 3 major events leading up to the Jewish, appropriation of Jerusalem, rendering it ultimately an Israelite city and ultimately the city of the temple. The first event we tend to overlook, and that is Goliath's head was brought to Jerusalem after he was defeated, according to 1 Samuel. By the way, if you ever take a trip with some people, I can actually show you the road where the head, it comes up from Emek HaElah, taking the road to Beitar Elit, and there was a Christian campsite. It was actually a church, and then it became a medieval Khan, And the tradition is that's where they were bringing Goliath's head to Jerusalem, but in the end they left it there. And there's a big mound of pebbles there. And apparently during the Middle Ages, everybody would throw a pebble, right, commemorating where Goliath's head was deposited. But it was on the way to Jerusalem, right? Following that, of course, the conquest of the citadel of Zion in the second book of Samuel, chapter 5. Ultimately, the transfer of the Holy Ark from its temporary site in Kiryat Ye'arim to the city of David. But the fact is that even after those events, there's still not certainty that Jerusalem was a chosen city known to the Jews, or the Judean people at large. The absence of a holy or capital city is repeated even in Solomon's prayer upon completion of the temple, or inaugurating the temple. God himself is quoted in 1 Kings 8:16. You don't have this on your sheet. I didn't have room for any more sources on these 4 pages. So we read where God says, "Since the day that I brought forth my people Israel out of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel to build a house that my name might be there." In other words, basically Solomon is quoting God as saying, there has not been yet a chosen city by any name. So David and then Solomon really set the history of Jerusalem in motion. That, according to the Bible. However, when you get to the post-biblical period, beginning already in the early Second Temple period, a new dimension of Jerusalem's history begins to emerge. And the tendency is to cite all sorts of biblical events or issues or personalities that appear in the early parts of the biblical narrative and to tell us that person came to Jerusalem, this event happened in Jerusalem, right? So suddenly there is I don't want to call it an imposition, but there is sort of a reestablishment of a Jerusalem-type history that reflects back on earlier times when, in fact, we know nothing about the city. What is interesting is the creators of this, and of course I'm going to elaborate on this in a minute, the creators of this earlier history of Jerusalem, this prehistory of Jerusalem, were not of one specific group. It's not some sect or some sectarian approach that created a prehistory. But we're going to find that a wide variety of people, some of them not even Jewish, were already party to this idea that there's a prehistory to Jerusalem, that Jerusalem is a lot more ancient than what you might think. Not that these non-Jews knew the Bible, but they will begin Jerusalem's history much, much earlier. A third stage, when we come to the mid-Second Temple period and then to rabbinic literature, will render the prehistory of Jerusalem even more ancient. And it'll take us back to the very days of creation, but we have time for that. I'd like to begin, however, with a widespread phenomenon that appears in classical literature. And that's why the title of our talk is, Pre-Histories of Jerusalem in Greco-Roman, Rabbinic, and Christian literature. If the Greeks and Romans, or if certain Greeks and Romans, knew of any event in Jewish history, this was the Exodus story. This is one of the most popular stories bandied about by Greco-Roman authors in ancient literature. It appears, as we'll see in a few minutes, in all sorts of versions, some of them reflecting the events in a very positive way as far as Jews are concerned, others going in the exact opposite direction, using the Exodus story to belittle the antiquity of Israel. But in both cases, Jerusalem plays a prominent role. And here I would ask you to take these sources that you have in front of you. The earliest mention of the Exodus story, as I said, coincides probably with the earliest mention of Jerusalem in Greco-Roman literature. It appears in the writings of a fellow called Hecataeus of Abdera. Hecataeus was a Greek who made his way to Egypt, wrote a history of Egypt, and within the context of that history refers to Jews, at times to Judaism, not just to Jews, but to the behavior of the earliest behavior of the Jewish people. And in that context, he gives us one version of the Exodus story. Here I have to mention one very important source, which helped me to prepare not just these pages, but to actually study the whole issue in general. And this, of course, I'm referring to the work of my dear and late teacher, Professor Menachem Stern, who wrote a 3-volume work, Greek and Latin authors on Jews and Judaism. And you can't imagine a more monumental study than what Stern produced. Stern was a unique scholar. His memory was unbelievable. I mean, I could just tell you these stories about him and we could fill up the whole hour and a half that we have. There are some brilliant people whom, if you ask them a question, does such and such issue appear anywhere in ancient literature, they will say, well, yes, I remember this. And then they'll think a few more minutes and there's this. I could ask Professor Stern, tell me, does the word such and such, or does the issue of such and such appear anywhere in Greco-Roman literature? And he would close his eyes for a few seconds and then say, no. Now, he realized he would shut his eyes and very, very quickly go through all of Greco-Roman literature. And of course, what he did for me, he saved me 50 hours in the library, right? I knew if he said no, right, it's not there. And if it is there, but he doesn't know it, no one else will find it anyway. And so I used Stern, of course, in preparing these sources. And as I said, the first author to refer to the founding of Jerusalem is Hecataeus of Abdera. Hecataeus wrote around the year 300 BCE. And you see here on your source sheet number 1, Hecataeus, his source did not come down to us directly, but it's quoted by another Greek historian, Diodorus Siculus, and I'm giving you the English translation from Stern's book, Greek and Latin authors. I want to read these sources because you see the nuances in describing how Jerusalem was founded. When in ancient times a pestilence arose in Egypt, the common people ascribed their troubles to the workings of a divine agency. In other words, Hecataeus tells us there was some sort of pestilence in Egypt, and the Egyptians did not know why they deserved this, what's wrong. And then they discovered, right, that they ascribed their troubles to the workings of an agency, for indeed with many strangers of all sorts dwelling in their midst, practicing different rites of religion and sacrifice, their own traditional observances in honor of the gods had fallen into disuse. In other words, and we'll see, of course, that he's referring to the Jews ultimately. But he doesn't say anything nasty about them here. All he says is there were groups of foreigners in our midst who worshiped differently than the indigenous Egyptian population. As a result, the local indigenous gods were angry and took their anger out on us with all sorts of either pestilence or all sorts of other plagues. In other words, this is not demeaning to the foreigners, but simply they were different. You'll see why I'm stressing this in a few minutes. Hence, the natives of the land surmised that unless they removed the foreigners, their troubles would never be resolved. At once, therefore, the aliens were driven from the country. Now, it's interesting to see where these aliens go. Right? And the most outstanding and active among them banded together, and some say were cast ashore in Greece. and certain other regions. Their leaders were notable men, chief among them being Danaos and Cadmos, 3 mythological Greek heroes. So, and of course, you realize the other foreigners are us, which means, according to Hecatius, we're in good company, right? Not only were the Israelites banished from Egypt, but the Greeks were also, right? So we start our history, as I say, in good company. But now comes the important section. But the greater number were driven into what is now called Judea, which is not far distant from Egypt, and was at that time utterly uninhabited. Not quite. And I'm going to get to this in a few minutes. But now, because does this mean that Hecatius did not know the Bible? We'll get to this in a second. Nevertheless, the land was uninhabited. The colony was headed by a man called Moses, outstanding both for his wisdom and for his courage. On taking possession of the land, he founded, besides other cities, one that is now the most renowned of all, called Jerusalem. He most certainly then doesn't know his Bible, or ignores the biblical narrative. A, because the land was not uninhabited. B, because Moses did not conquer the land. And C, and what is most important for us, he certainly didn't found the city of Jerusalem. But for Hecatius, this was very important. We'll see in a second. Right? In addition, he established the temple that they hold in chief veneration. Instituted their forms of worship and ritual, drew up their laws, and ordered their political institutions. Hecatius goes on, and first of all, this is a very favorable description. And Hecatius continues by saying almost that Moses could do no wrong. He picked out the men, and this you don't have in front of you, the men of the most refinement and greatest ability to lead the nation, and he appointed them priests, right? And among them, the person superior in wisdom would become the high priest. And we know that it's very often the son of a high priest, but for him, the whole establishment created by Moses was ideal. He divided them into 12 tribes because 12 is the most wonderful number, right? And it coincides with all sorts with the stars and so on. The common citizens were, he even knows some halachot. Common citizens were forbidden to sell their individual plots. Let there be some who would take advantage of this. Sometimes his praise really makes you wonder. He required that those who dwelt in the land rear their children. He required those who lived there to, you have to require people to rear their children. Well, remember, in a Greek atmosphere, where Spartans at least were placing, if you had too many daughters in Sparta, right, one was usually considered enough, and the rest, to say nothing of sickly babies, would simply be left to perish. He required that you raise children. And now comes my favorite line. And since offspring could be cared for at little cost, the Jews were from the start a populous nation, right? Right. In other words, you can just imagine, right, the Jewish husband or wife saying to their spouse, it doesn't really cost that much. Let's have another one, right? But now what is this? Scholars, of course, have dealt tremendously with Hecatius, and the big suspicion was it's too good. Do we really believe a Greek wrote this? Some people claimed that, in fact, this is Jewish propaganda, that some Jew wrote this presentation, right, and falsely identified himself as Hecatius, but that this, in fact, is propaganda to enhance the stature of Jews in the eyes of foreigners. Others claim, no, Hecatius may have written it, or may have written the original version, but it was revised, maybe, by a Jew to put it in a more favorable light. But the question is, why did Hecatius present the history of Jerusalem the way he did, as founded by Moses? If you read Hecatius carefully, you will find that this adheres perfectly to Greek ethnography. The Greeks imagined that every nation that respects itself is founded according to a series of events, and steps taken by the ultimate founder of the nation. What does the ultimate founder do? He conquers their land. He sets up their legal constitution. And he builds their city, the polis. Because you cannot have civilization, you cannot have culture without having a Greek city. You know, our word in English, city, comes from the Latin civis, which is also the root for civilization. In other words, in the ancient mind, the city and civilization go together. And so, in telling the story of the Exodus, which basically is the story of the foundation story of the people of Israel, you have to bring in the history of Jerusalem. Otherwise, the whole narrative would be lacking, right? It would not be perfect. And Hecataeus is trying to give us a perfect presentation. Now, and here, of course, we ask the question, if this were a Jewish, some anonymous Jew writing, would that Jew not have known the Bible? But as we'll see today, all sorts of Jews presented events and persons of the Bible in a manner that was not known in biblical literature and at times might even contradict biblical literature. Now, let me give you an example of what one very famous Jew did, which kind of adheres to what Hecataeus did, and that's Josephus himself, the great Jewish historian. In the fourth book of Antiquities, he describes the Jewish constitution, the legal basis for Jewish life. And he tries to paraphrase the Bible, and then you get to this section, where God instructs the Jewish people as follows: whensoever, having conquered the land of Canaan and being at leisure to enjoy these bounties, ye shall determine from that time forward to found cities. Again, right? Josephus is writing for a Greek audience, for a Greek reading audience, and so clearly the Jewish constitution must have the founding of cities as its core requirement. This is what you should do, that your action may be pleasing to God and your felicity assured. And now he goes a step further. He claims that already the biblical constitution demands, let there be one holy city in that place in the land of Canaan that is fairest and most famous for its excellence, a city which God shall choose for himself by prophetic oracle. Josephus claims that this is the biblical constitution. You'll search in vain for this. There's no requirement for a holy city in the Torah. Right? In other words, in presenting the Constitution, Josephus is playing along with what Hecataeus, not that he's quoting, he knew Hecataeus, he knew this section, or he knew another section of Hecataeus for sure, possibly this one as well, but he's playing the same game, right? Jews from the very beginning knew the importance of founding cities. The Exodus story, however, could be told in a totally different way, by people who had no love for Israel, but used it for all sorts of political reasons, usually connected with Egypt, but not always. The most famous, one of the most famous and anti-Jewish presentations appears in the writings, this is number 3 on your handout, of an Egyptian priest, Manetho, right, who presents a long, long story for which I recommend you go to the Israel Museum and see the exhibition that's still on, Pharaoh in Canaan, right? Manetho tells in great detail the story of the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, taking place somewhere around the 15th century, 16th century BCE. And it's a long, long, drawn-out story. Where shepherds of one sort or another invade the country, conquer all of Egypt. They set up their cities near the Nile Delta, and they rule the land for some 500 years, 511 years according to Manetho. Ultimately, the Egyptians revolt after hundreds of years and succeed in driving the Hyksos, these shepherds, out of the country. And this was one of the foundation stories, very, very popular in Egypt. Manetho tells the whole story without any reference to Jews, or to Israelites, or to Canaan, right? These are invaders who took over the country of Egypt for hundreds of years. And I just gave you one or two lines in number 3 of the Manetho, of the Hyksos story, and then notice what he does. He claims that a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, that's as precise as he'll get, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. Their race as a whole was called Hyksos, that is, king shepherds. And now, as I put in parentheses, there follows a long description of the downfall of the Hyksos and their expulsion. And now, Manetho adds a final 2-3 lines to the Hyksos story. You have no idea who they are until he gets to the conclusion. The shepherds, with their possessions and households complete, no fewer than 240,000 persons, left Egypt and journeyed over the desert into Syria. There, dreading the power of the Assyrians, who were at that time masters of Asia, they built in the land now called Judea a city large enough to hold all those thousands of people, and gave it the name of Jerusalem. In other words, what he did here is he tells the story of these barbarians, these hoodlums, who have taken over the country. And then he ends his story by saying, and if you have any doubt who these people are, today they have a city called Jerusalem. And so by doing this, he attaches, right, the identity of the Hyksos, right, by using and referring to the city of Jerusalem. So it was the Hyksos, the invaders and conquerors of Egypt, who ultimately were forced to leave the land, and they built Jerusalem. Totally different from Hecataeus. Now you have all sorts of versions in between. I gave you one here by Diodorus, a 1st century BCE compiler of earlier materials, right, who describes that when King Antiochus was laying siege to Jerusalem, you remember the evil King Antiochus, he was advised by his friends to wipe out completely the race of Jews. They pointed out, too, that the ancestors of the Jews had been driven out of Egypt as men who were impious and detested by the gods. For by way of purging the country, all persons who had white or leprous marks on their bodies had been assembled. And now begins a story that repeats itself. Those that were driven out of Egypt were lepers. And so the land was cleansed by driving these people out of the land, right? And so if they had white or leprous marks on their bodies, they were assembled, driven across the border as being under a curse. Refugees had occupied the territory round about Jerusalem, and having organized the nation of the Jews, made their hatred of mankind into a tradition. Now he introduces a well-known staple in Greek anti-Jewish historiography. Jews are misanthropic. This will carry on into Roman historiography as well. Tacitus, the Roman historian, will tell us they are misanthropic. They don't marry us. They don't eat with us. Everything that we consider sacred, they consider to be vile, and vice versa, right? And now, Moses introduced utterly outlandish laws, not to break bread with any other race, nor to show them any goodwill at all. This version takes on a life of its own. Jerusalem, there's another description here, number 5, by Lysimachos, who's probably after Manetho and Apion in the 1st century, one of the most, I would say, extreme anti-Jewish authors, Greek authors. He writes a somewhat similar description to the plague a disease that takes place in Egypt, forcing the malignant people to be removed from the city. And if you look in the middle there, we are. Right. On the next day, a certain Moses advised them to take their courage in their hands and make a straight track until they reached inhabited country. Now it's very interesting. You remember Hecataeus? the land was uninhabited. Beginning with some of the later Greek authors, the land was inhabited, instructing them to show goodwill to no man, to offer not the best but the worst advice, to overthrow any temples and altars of the gods which they found. The rest assenting, they proceeded to put these decisions into practice. They traversed the desert and after great hardships reached inhabited country. I'll get back to that issue of inhabited in a minute. There they maltreated the population, plundered and set fire to temples, till they came to the country now called Judea, where they built a city in which they settled. And now he plays with the name of the city. This town they called Hierozila because of their sacrilegious propensities. The name Hierozolima, Jerusalem, the Greeks refer to as Hierozolima. Hieros in Greek means sanctity, something sacred. But Hierozila means, right, sacrilegious. In other words, Chilul HaKodesh, destroying the sacred. And they were so proud of their destroying other temples that they called their capital city Hierozila, named after the destruction of other temples. At a later date, when they had risen to power, they altered the name to avoid the disgraceful imputation, and called the city Hierozolima, and themselves Hierozolimites. And so now we hear how Jerusalem was ultimately founded, right, as the culmination not only of driving out these lepers or sick people, but after a vicious conquest of the land. Now, why is this important? It has nothing to do with our lecture, but it's a good lesson in how to read Rashi to the Torah. I'm sure there are many people in the audience who remember the very first Rashi to the Bible, right? Why does the Torah begin with creation and not with the first mitzvah, right, which appears in the book of Exodus, chapter 12? Okay? And the answer that Rashi gives is, okay, that God begins with creation because the nations of the world, lest the nations of the world complain about what? The Israelites, okay? Listim atem. You are criminals, you are crooks, you stole the land from its original inhabitants. What do you answer according to the rabbis? God created the world and he divided the real estate according to his own desire. That phrase in Rashi, She'im yomru umot ha'olam listim atem, lest the nations of the world say, you are criminals who stole the land, that's lisimachos, that's manatho. When the rabbis say, should the nations of the world say something, they have the equivalent of Stern's Greek and Latin author in their hands. In other words, we should not take that as some hypothetical, possible eventuality, but in fact, they were responding to a particular attack that did not exist in early Greek literature. In other words, Hecataeus doesn't know about this. They entered a land that was uninhabited. And so here you find something very interesting, that the founding of Jerusalem gets caught up in a political attack, as it were, against Jews as having stolen a land or doing away with the local inhabitants of a land. The foundation of Jerusalem assumes a fascination in classical literature. So much so that when you come to the Roman period, the first century, Tacitus lived in the first century. He lived actually during the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. The great Roman historian gives us 5 different versions about the founding of Jerusalem. All of them, of course, predating David and Solomon. In other words, he presents 5 different prehistories of how Jerusalem came about. What does this tell me? That by the time you reach the Roman period, Jerusalem had assumed a name. Now we know that ultimately one of the famous Pliny, one of the famous Roman historians who lived during the destruction of the Second Temple period and then slightly afterwards until he found out that one should not get too close to an erupting volcano, right, in Rome at the end of the 70s. But Pliny says Jerusalem, the most famous city not only of Judea but of all of the East. It became a very famous city. Tacitus is going to describe the destruction of Jerusalem. But look at what he has to say. Source number 6. However, as I am about to describe the last days of a famous city, Jerusalem, he's going to describe the destruction of the Second Temple and Jerusalem, it seems proper for me to give some account of its origin. And now comes a very, very detailed, right, description of how the city was founded. It is said that the Jews were originally exiles from the island of Crete. An argument in favor of this is derived from the name. There is a famous mountain in Crete called Ida, which was later lengthened into the barbarous form Judai. Some hold that in the reign of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, right, the superfluous, meaning the overflow, of the population of Egypt under the leadership of Hierozolimus and Iuda discharged itself on the neighboring lands. In other words, there were two leaders, two mythological leaders called Hierozolimus and Iuda, so Yerushalayim and Yehuda, right, who are from the overflow of the Egyptian population, and they set up the city. Many others think they were, there's a typo there, they were an Ethiopian stock, which in the reign of Cepheus was forced to migrate by fear and hatred. Still others say that the Jews are of illustrious origin, being the Solimai, a people celebrated in Homer's poems, who founded a city and gave it the name Hierozolima, formed from their own. Most authors agree that once during a plague, now Tacitus goes back to the plague story, right? During a plague in Egypt which caused bodily disfigurement, King Bacchorus approached the oracle of Ammon, and here, as I say, follows a description similar to that of Lysimachus, with one addition of a herd of donkeys that led them to the source of water. This is very interesting. Tacitus tells us, and it appears in one other source, that the Jews were in the desert and had no water to drink. We remember that story. But except he doesn't know the hitting of the rock, he tells us that a herd of donkeys led the Israelites to a water source, and as a result, I skipped this, the Jews worship a donkey to this day. And then we are told that one of the kings, upon conquering Jerusalem, entered into the Holy of Holies and found the form of a donkey or a donkey's head, or according to one story, a man, apparently Moses, sitting on a donkey, as it were, because they worship the donkey to this day. And by the way, there is graffiti that was found in Rome from a later period that has the sign of a cross, and on the cross there is a crucifixion of what appears to be a person but with a donkey head. This issue of the worship of donkeys, right? This, if you want to read about this, I wrote the article, Ass Worship, in the Encyclopedia Judaica, and everything you want to know about ass worship, you'll find either in that article or in the bibliography there. But so Tacitus knows about this, right? Or he's heard about this, and then he goes on, and I'll continue here, right? This relieved them, they found water, and then they marched 6 days continuously, and on the 7th seized the country, expelling the former inhabitants. Here again, im yomru listimate, right? There they founded a city and dedicated a temple. And so you find that Greco-Roman historiography places the origins of Jerusalem way, way back in history to the Exodus story. Now the question, of course, is how did this begin? How did all these Greeks and Romans hear about the Exodus story? Unless we assume that some Jewish version, maybe, as I say, one of an apologetic nature, such as Hecataeus, made an appearance And then Greek and Roman authors picked up on that Exodus story, which once may have had a positive role to play in presenting Jews, but as animosity towards Jews began to spread and to become more and more enhanced, the story changes and becomes very, very negative. The last Greek I want to refer to, however, has an interesting twist about not only how Jerusalem was founded, but why it was founded, where it was founded. And this is the geographer Strabo. Strabo lived in the 1st century BC into the 1st century of the Common Era. He writes a geography, as you can see here, and he tells us the following. Moses was one of the Egyptian priests, but he went away from there to Judea, since he was displeased with the state of affairs there in Egypt, and was accompanied by many people who worshipped the divine being. For he said and taught that the Egyptians were mistaken in representing the divine being by the images of beasts and cattle. Now comes the story. Now Moses persuaded not a few thoughtful men, and led them away to this place where the settlement of Jerusalem now is. And he easily took possession of the place, since it was not a place that would be looked on with envy. Right. Nor yet one for which anyone would make a serious fight. If only Strabon was prophetic. Right? Who would ever fight over Jerusalem? Right? And it's kind of, well, you read it, you have to smile or cry, or I don't know why, right? For it is rocky, and although it itself is well supplied by water, its surrounding territory is barren and waterless, and that's why they chose that. In other words, Moses chose Jerusalem because he knew no one else would want it, right? And so we see here one aspect of the prehistory of Jerusalem. But if the Greco-Roman authors predate Jerusalem to the Exodus, Jewish sources went much further back. In fact, as far back as you can go. Jerusalem becomes prominent with the creation of the world. And it has a role to play in the creation of the world. So, take it as page number 3. Here we are. The Midrash. And by the way, I'd recommend on this issue an interesting book which you won't be able to find in stores anymore. My good friend and colleague, Professor Daniel Sperber of Bar-Ilan University, once produced a book called Midrash Yerushalem, right? And he collected a metaphysical history of Jerusalem. And he collected a number of sources and has some very serious scholarship here in the back in his footnotes that describe many of these sources, or not many, but some of the sources that we're going to read in the next few minutes. This idea of how how the Jews imagined God and Jerusalem coming together at the very, very earliest stage of creation. And so let's read this first Midrash that takes us into the issue. When the Holy One, blessed be He, created His world, He created it as a human being. Just as a human being begins to be formed from his navel, and from there is stretched progressively outwards in 4 directions, so the Holy One, blessed is He, began to create His world from the stone of foundation. The word in Hebrew is even shetiyah. And there's a big problem in how to translate that word, even shetiyah. Shin taf yod hey. In Hebrew, lihiyot mushtat is to be established upon, to be founded upon. So even shetiyah might be translated as the stone of foundation of the world. However, the word in Hebrew sheti va'erev, also means what? Weaving, right? And the late Professor Lieberman, in referring to this source and to parallel sources, actually suggests that upon it the world was woven. In other words, God is weaving the as it were, from the first stitches, and He's weaving it out. So it's either stretching or weaving. But now we have another source. Numbers 9. Where is this navel? Where is this center of the world, right? Well, it's the foundation stone, and that's already a hint. The foundation stone, Even Shetiyah, is, of course, on the Temple Mount. Now, of course, you realize if UNESCO decides that we have no connection to the Temple Mount, please just ignore these next few sources, right? This will be a major decision, and I'm waiting with bated breath to know what they decide about this. Just as the navel is in the center of the human body, so the Sanhedrin sits in Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the center of the world. And in another version, Tanchuma Leviticus, just as the navel is placed in the center of the human body, so too is the land of Israel in the center of the world. The land of Israel is the center of the world, and Jerusalem is the center of the land of Israel. What's going on here? How does Jerusalem come into this? This is a well-known phenomenon in the study of religions. The idea being that there is an axis connecting whatever deity is there, right, God, with the world. And you look for the closest point of proximity between the deity above somewhere and the world below. And when you can identify where that closest point of proximity is, then you'll know where creation began. In other words, God has to become very, very close to the created world. He will begin at the closest point possible, and then it will be stretched out. And the idea will be that Jerusalem is the closest point possible. And this, of course, takes us to source number 10. You shall arise and go up. Vekamta ve'alita. This teaches that the land of Israel is higher than all other lands, and the temple higher than the rest of the land of Israel. In other words, what do you have here? You have the temple of Jerusalem being supposedly the highest point, or if you wish, the closest point to the Creator, and so that's where the two will ultimately meet, and that's where creation will begin. And this sets into motion a whole different type of prehistory for Jerusalem. The role of Jerusalem in not only the creation of the world, but ultimately in the creation of humankind as well. Jerusalem has a role to play in human history. But before we even get to humankind, because God is so close or adjacent to that city of Jerusalem, we find something very interesting. It would be the ideal place to what? To pray. Because when you come to Jerusalem, you are coming to the site closest to the deity that created the world. And here I would almost pose a question. Who was the first to pray in Jerusalem? Any answers from the audience? Right? You say Abraham. Any other suggestions? You're not going to guess. Right? So okay, we'll see. If I were to say who was the first human, that might be something else. But look at source 11. The first one to pray in Jerusalem was God. Now, of course, this raises questions. Who's he praying to? Isn't he certain? I mean, can't he just achieve whatever he desires, right? Why pray? Nevertheless, source number 11. Okay? Vayihi b'Shalem Sukkot. In Shalem is his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion. Rabbi Berechia said, from the beginning of the creation of the world, the Holy One, blessed be he, made a tabernacle for himself in Jerusalem. Now, of course, the tabernacle is the precursor to the temple, right? He has a sukkah, which ultimately would become, right, a temple, right? And as it were, kiveyachol, as it were, prayed in it. Now, of course, you wonder, what's going to be in this prayer? Right? Saying, may it be... Now, the Hebrew has, I added the word my, because I really don't know how to translate it. Yehi ratzon sheh. Let it be a desire. Whose desire, right? The only desire that makes any sense is my desire, right? So I added the word my. If I'm wrong, you'll forgive me, right? May it be my will that my children do my will, in order that I may not destroy my house and my temple. So the earliest, and see what's happening here is they are setting into motion the idea that since this is the closest proximity to God, and since God already has set into motion the idea that prayer in Jerusalem has an effect, is heard, hence God is the first to have prayed, and he is giving, as it were, he's telling us this is what you shall do. And now comes something very interesting. Once you assume that God prayed in Jerusalem, you can easily assume that all sorts of other people that are connected to altars and to worship in the earliest portions of the Bible must have done it in Jerusalem as well. So for instance, number 13, and Noah built an altar to God. This is Genesis 8, there's a mistake here. And Noah built it, when he leaves the ark, he builds an altar. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov said, on the great altar in Jerusalem, the place where Adam sacrificed. So now this is interesting. Adam sacrificed in Jerusalem. Noah sacrificed in Jerusalem, right? Later on, we're going to encounter, well, who comes next after Noah? Abraham. But Abraham did something else, right? Abraham wanted to sacrifice his son Isaac. Where does he do this? He does this on Mount Moriah, Har HaMoriah. If you read the Torah's account, you have no idea where Mount Moriah is. It's there. It's Vayaret HaMakom Merachok. We'll get back to the word Makom, but that's it. However, when you get to the book of Chronicles, to Divrei Hayamim, the book of which already takes us into the early Second Temple period, right? They already know that Mount Moriah is, in fact, the equivalent to Jerusalem. So already you find this idea of identifying sites in the earliest portions of the Torah with Jerusalem. By the way, we'll get back to Adam in a second. Abraham then brought his son Isaac. Later on, Isaac returns to the site. Right? Maybe we'll just look very briefly at 14. Rabbi Shimon said, the Holy One, blessed be he, pointed out the altar with a finger to Abraham our father and said to him, this is the altar, when he gets to Moriah. This was the altar whereupon Cain and Abel sacrificed. We didn't mention that. It was the same altar where Noah and his sons sacrificed. As it says, and Abraham built HaMizbeach. And Abraham built an altar is not written there, but and Abraham built the altar there. The special altar, the well-known altar. This was the altar upon which the first ones of old had sacrificed. And again, this is where Adam sacrificed. This is very interesting, of course. Adam, what is Adam sacrificing? Well, some of you may have heard this from me in another context. Well, we know that Adam already kept a number of the laws of the Torah. This is an interesting process, and we'll get to this just in a few minutes. For the rabbis, Adam is not the first human being, or only the first human being. He ultimately evolves as the first Jew. What language did Adam speak? Of course, Hebrew, of course, right? He spoke Hebrew. He, not only did he speak Hebrew, he actually wrote one of the Psalms, and it's quite, you can almost guess which Psalm he wrote. Remember, when was he created? On the sixth day, right? On Erev Shabbat. And as soon as that turned into the seventh day, what did he write? Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat. He wrote the chapter of Psalms, right? Imagine a one-day-old Jew writing a chapter of Psalms, right? Not bad. Well, not one day old, but one day into his creation, right? He kept the laws of Sabbath. He kept the laws of Eruv, according to the rabbis. By the way, this is not unique to the rabbis. The books of the Second Temple period, the Book of Jubilees, already imagines the earliest biblical figures keeping the Torah even before the Torah was kept. My favorite example, of course, was he offered up a sacrifice. There's an altar here. Which sacrifice? According to the rabbis, he altered up the Passover sacrifice. which is very interesting. I mean, the Jews had not yet gone down to Egypt, let alone been redeemed from Egypt. But he's already celebrating Passover, and I always like to say that what I found fascinating is not so much Adam celebrating Passover. My imagination takes me to Eve cleaning the Garden of Eden, right? On those last days before Adam is going to offer up this. What was there to clean? Polishing apples, maybe, or something. To say nothing of hechsherim that were probably that were either accepted or not. In other words, this whole imagery of Adam already sacrificing, but as we'll see in a few minutes, he's sacrificing where he lives, and where he lives is where he was created, and where he was created was in Jerusalem. And everything suddenly focuses around the city. And so you have here, and by the way, later on in source number 15, Rabbi Judah said, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, was barren for 20 years. After 20 years, Isaac took Rebekah and went with her to Mount Moriah, to the place where he had been bound, and he prayed on her behalf. Right? In other words, a whole series of events that we could not know. And I could have given you another example. Jacob, you remember when Jacob is running away from Esau, right? And he stops at the very beginning of Parashat Vayetze, right? He stops and he sleeps and he gathers 12 stones and he places those stones under his head and he goes to sleep, right? According to the rabbis, those were 12 stones from the altar in Jerusalem. How do we know this, right? With Jacob, what do we find written? Vayifga bamakom. He arrived at the place. Vayikach me'avnei hamakom. He took from stones of the place. But you remember the story of Abraham and the Akedah. Vayar et hamakom merachok. He saw the place. In other words, everything goes back to the same spot now, and Jerusalem becomes the main stage for all of these events. And these events, of course, ultimately take us to King David. And then source number 16 tells us the following. When God saw David standing and grieving over the temple, meaning grieving that he could not build the temple, he immediately sent God the prophet to him, and he showed him the place of the temple. As it is written, and God came that day to David and said unto him, go up and raise an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. We'll get back to Araunah. He's going to play a role in a few minutes in our story. And so David goes up to the Jebusite town of Araunah and found there the altar upon which Adam sacrificed, and upon which Noah sacrificed, and upon which Abraham sacrificed. In other words, how did David know where to build the temple? He found remnants of all of those, right? You can imagine the dream of every archaeologist, right? He found remnants of those early altars exactly on the site of Jerusalem where he will build the temple. When he found it, he began measuring and proclaimed, from here to there, the Azara. From here to there, the Holy of Holies. So David did not build the temple, but what did he do? He drew the blueprint, as it were, for the Temple Mount. So all this begins with what? Creation in Jerusalem and Adam living in Jerusalem. But it's not just Adam living in Jerusalem. Adam, according to the rabbis, and according to Second Temple material, even pre-rabbinic, was created from the dust of Jerusalem, from the dust of the altar. And here we have a number of stories that tell us not only was he created from the dust of the altar, he will be buried in the same spot. And this is going to set into motion a very, very serious theological, not a debate, but rather the basis for theological, for a Christian theology regarding the crucifixion and the connection of the crucifixion to where Adam was created and buried. It begins with Second Temple sources, and I gave you two. one of them is the second book of Enoch, where we are told that Melchizedek was priest and king in the place Achuzan. Now, Achuzan is a very strange word, and scholars have gone out of their way to understand it. It has to do with something in the temple area, as we'll see in a minute. And the book of Ezekiel, actually in chapter 48, lines 20 and 21, Et Trumat HaKodesh, they raised up a contribution to the holy place, El Achuzat Ha'ir. The word is Achuzat Ha'ir. And the word Achuzat Ha'ir appears twice in Ezekiel, and people think that that's where Achuzan comes from. So Melchizedek, who is of course the king of Shalem, which ultimately will be connected with Jerusalem, was priest and king in the place of Achuzan, that is to say, the center of the earth, where Adam was created, and there will be his final grave. Now, hold back. I know some of you are thinking, but wait a minute, that's not Adam's final grave. Hold back with the question. I will leave you with a possible identification of Adam's grave. I won't, actually. You'll see. I'll leave you in doubt in the end. Nevertheless, it was there that he was created, and there he will be his final grave. And in connection with that archpriest, Melchizedek, it is written how he also will be buried there, where the center of the earth is. Now you see how they're putting together all of these sources. The source that we saw, Jerusalem, is the center of the earth. It's the place of the altar. It's the place where Adam was created and will be buried, just as Adam also buried his own son there, Abel. We have a long description of Adam, the dead body of, in another book of the late Second Temple period, the book of Adam and Eve. We're told, then Adam's body lay there, he's dead, in paradise on the earth. Seth grieved exceedingly over him. Then God spoke to the archangel Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Raphael, go away to paradise in the third heaven and cover the body of Adam. And there's a long description of how his body is laying there. And three angels came and they prepared him for burial. And God said, let the body of Abel also be brought. And they brought other linen clothes and prepared his body also. For he was unburied since the day when Cain, his brother, slew him. For wicked Cain took great pains to conceal him, but could not. For the earth would not receive him. That phrase is interesting. Remember that phrase. The earth would not receive Cain, right? Abel. For the body sprang up from the earth, and a voice went out of the earth, saying, I will not receive a companion body till the earth which was taken. Adam was created from the earth, taken from him, cometh to me. At that time the angels took it and placed it on a rock, till Adam his father was buried. And both were buried according to the commandment of God in the spot where God found the dust. And he caused the place to be dug for two. What is this? This is the first appearance of what will ultimately be embraced by some of the rabbinic texts as well. The idea being Adam was created from the dust where the altar would be built because he needs from day one repentance. He will be created from the dust under the altar where he will be returned. He will be returned El ha'adama asher lukach misham, to the earth from whence he was taken. There he will be returned, and that is part of a atonement, as it were, for Adam in earth. And we have one very interesting midrash. It's a midrash referred to as Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. Fact is, it's a late midrash. It's early medieval. It's from the Gaonic period, somewhere from the 8th or 9th century. But it is unique in that it preserved traditions going way back into the Second Temple period. There are traditions from the book of Jubilees, way back in the Second Temple period, that appear in this midrash called Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. And one of the issues that appears there is Adam, his creation, and his burial. And so he drove out Adam, right, from the Garden of Eden. He was driven out from the Garden of Eden and settled on Mount Moriah. In other words, now we're placing Adam in Jerusalem again. For the gate of the Garden of Eden is nigh unto Mount Moriah. And this appears in the book of Jubilees. From there, Moriah, he took him, and thither he made him return. From Moriah he was taken, and there he will return, to the place whence he was taken. For it says, and the Lord God took Adam. From whence did he take him, meaning create him? From the place of the temple, as it says, to till the ground from whence he was taken. And this is linked up with let me give you the source before we read it. The idea is God creates Adam from the dust under the altar. He will be returned there. However, you may know, some of you may be familiar with another rabbinic tradition. From where was Adam created? And Rashi brings it, actually. God took dust from the four corners of the earth, and he brought that dust together and created Adam. Why? So that wherever Adam, or man, should die and wish to be buried, the land there could not say what? No, this is a foreigner. In other words, you have two radically different approaches regarding the creation of Adam. One is localized in Jerusalem specifically. He will be buried. He was created there. He will be buried in Jerusalem. And in a moment I'll tell you where he's buried. And the other is he is humankind. He was created, right, as a world human being, which would enable his burial to take place wherever he should die, and his sons wished to bury him. Now let's read the Midrash, number 20. And you'll see that the Midrash seems to know both versions. He began to collect the dust of the first man from the four corners of the world. The Midrash begins with the second version, that Adam is created from the four corners. Why did he gather man's dust from the four corners of the world? Thus said the Holy One, blessed be he. If a man should come from the east to the west, or from the west to the east, and his time comes to depart from the world, then the earth shall not say, the dust of your body is not mine. Return to the place whence thou wast created. But this teaches that in every place where a man goes or comes, and his end approaches, when he must depart from the world, there it returns to the dust, so that man can be buried anywhere. However, in the very same Midrash, you read a bit later, he formed the lumps. It's a typo here. He formed the lumps of the dust of the first man into a mass in a clean place, where it was in the navel of the earth. Now, you have two radically different approaches here. One, that he's created then from the dust of the navel, and we saw where the navel is. That's in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the highest point in the world. And now something fascinating takes place as we move from Jewish literature into Christian literature. Where does the crucifixion take place? Well, certainly in Jerusalem, but where? It depends who you ask, obviously. In early Eastern tradition and Catholic tradition, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? And what do you have? There you have something very, very interesting. The tradition was, according to one of the two traditions, where is Adam buried? In Jerusalem. Where? In the Temple Mount. Now, you may know that everything that the Jews, right, located on the Temple Mount in early Christian theology is moved, as it were, to the area of Golgotha, right? And all these traditions, Golgotha, of course, being where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today, right? And what do you have? You have Christ being crucified on the cross, And according to Christian tradition, and by the way, look at origin, number 21. I have an origin, church father, lives in Palestine, right, in Judea, in the 3rd century, in Caesarea, in the early 3rd century. He is certainly, right, well connected to some rabbinic traditions. He actually tells us they had a Jewish teacher. And he received a tradition that Adam's body was buried at the place of Christ's crucifixion. In other words, the two exist on the exact same spot. Now, this becomes very important in Christian theology. Why? Because the blood on the cross from the crucifixion, according to Christian theology, trickles down the cross, permeates the ground until it reaches what? Adam's burial site, thereby, right, being expiation for the sin of Adam, for the original sin. And so it is critical that they embrace that particular Jewish tradition that has Adam buried in Jerusalem under the altar, right, in the most sacred site, and that's where the crucifixion is, and the two are linked together. If you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today, you will be shown to Adam's crypt, right? They will take you to a room which is the crypt of Adam. And so here we find that these sources that brought creation to Jerusalem now become a staple, as it were, of early Christian theology. This, of course, caused a problem. People will start coming to Jerusalem looking, among other things, as they did, for Adam's burial site. And you know that with the embracing of Christianity by the Roman Empire in the 4th century, pilgrimage takes off. And people come here in growing and growing numbers, looking for ancient biblical sites. And one of those sites will be the grave of Adam, because that's, of course, the same place as the crucifixion, at least according to Origen and others. And the rabbis see this. Now, I don't know exactly when it took place, but you all know of another tradition. Where is Adam buried? Hebron. In Hebron. Now, what, and, you know, Me'arat HaMachpelah, Kiryat Arba, right? The 4 couples that are buried there, and the first couple is Adam and indeed. Why is he buried in Hebron? I mean, isn't Hebron a Jewish burial site? Or, right? Me'arat HaMachpelah? Can you bury a non-Jew in a Jewish cemetery? But of course, the answer we saw just a few minutes ago. Adam, in rabbinic eyes, becomes more and more the first Jew. There's a wonderful Midrash that explains why the Israelites were banished from the land of Israel way after the, first and second destructions of the temple, where God says, just as in the case of Adam, I commanded him such and such, in that case not to eat from the fruit of this tree, etc. I commanded Adam such and such. He did not adhere to my commandments, and so I banished him from the Garden of Eden. In a like manner, his sons, I commanded them such and such. They did not adhere to my commandments. I banished them from the land of Israel. And it's fascinating. His sons, the people of Israel, are Adam's sons. All of mankind is Adam's sons. Except that Midrash already identifies Adam as being, right, the first, if you want to call him the first Jew, or a pre-Jew. So there's something very interesting. There's a prehistory to Jerusalem, and then there's a prehistory accompanying it of the Jewish people. In other words, even before Abraham, there's already, right, a pre-Jewish phenomena with Adam speaking Hebrew, keeping mitzvot, and so on. Except that now you have an interesting phenomena where Christian pilgrims will begin to come to Jerusalem and look for Adam's gravesite. And I have to wonder, right, if sometime, who knows when, Adam's body was simply exhumed from Jerusalem and moved to Hebron. And it's very interesting because Second Temple traditions, as we saw here, know nothing about Adam's burial in Hebron, right? Nor do early rabbinic traditions know this, where there's one very famous Midrash where Esau wants to be buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah, and he's turned away because only the three patriarchs can be buried there and so on. And there's no mention, it doesn't say the three patriarchs and Adam, right? That Midrash doesn't know of Adam's burial there. So here you have a flip side to the story where Adam is buried in this prehistoric Jerusalem, right? At least according to some sources, and then is removed, as it were, by later rabbinic sources, maybe, as I said, maybe, I'm guessing here, as a reaction to what they knew Christian theology was doing, placing such an import, as it were, on his burial in Jerusalem, which I always found very fascinating. If you think about what we've seen today, we began by noting that if you want to attach a stigma to something being Jewish, right, like the Exodus story, so we saw how Manetto did it. How do you attach the stigma that it's a Jewish connection? And then in the end, they came to Jerusalem and conquered it, and that's their city. And everybody knows it's Jewish. When you get to Adam's burial, how do you maintain his Judaism? You've got to move him out of Jerusalem. Jerusalem now has been appropriated. The idea of a centrality of Jerusalem now belongs, at least beginning in the 4th century, to another group, right? They are going to build churches here in the city and so on. And at some stage, this prehistory of Jerusalem loses some of its potency, and you will move him to the city of Hebron. So it's strange how the prehistory begins for very definite reasons and then loses its potency for a totally different theological situation. There may be, and here I want to just give you an idea that was bandied around by the late Professor Louis Ginsberg, who taught at Jewish Theological Seminary many, many years ago. There is a text in the Talmud Yerushalmi, number 22. Rabbi Shimon Bar Zavdi said, the skull of Araunah the Jebusite was found under the altar. Now, I have to read this in Hebrew. Gulgulto shel Arnon hayevusi matzu tachat lamizbeach. Now, first of all, I hear the word Golgotha, right? Gulgolet. I mean, come on. Who cares where Aravna's Gulgolet is? And yet they tell me the Gulgolet, the skull, right, of Aravna Hayusi. However, Louis Ginsberg suggests, could it possibly be that Aravna Hayusi was written in shorthand by some scribe, and you would have had an aleph? I need a blackboard for this, so you'll have to bear with me, right? Aleph, Resh, Hey, right? Ravna, parenthesis, Hayevusi. However, a Resh can easily be mistaken or right? From what other letter? A Dalid. Let's assume, says Ginsberg, that it was Aleph Dalid Hey, Gulgulto shel Adam Harishon Nimtza Tachat HaMizbeach, that the Golgotha of Adam was under the altar. That would be perfect, because then we would have the word Golgotha in Jerusalem connected to Adam, and then that would, close, as it were, a circle, and we would find maybe a reference to this Christian connection to ancient Jerusalem, to prehistoric Jerusalem, going back to Adam already in the Palestinian Talmud. This is just a guess, but it's something that Louis Ginsberg used to love to do. He used to love to say, this must have been in parentheses, or must have been in shorthand, and some scribe then made a mistake. We have 10 minutes left, and I would be if there's anyone who wants to ask me any questions, this is the time, right? Yes, please. I will repeat the question, because if we're being tape live, they might not hear you. Yes. Yes, what is it? Okay. Yeah, well, again, it is and it isn't. It depends which Greek. All right, the question was, do we have a foundation story for Jerusalem that is diametrically opposed to the foundation story for Rome, which seems to be much more, I don't know, much more, I don't know, pedestrian or something, right? But no, again, the Moses stories connecting Moses to Jerusalem, I don't think were intended, at least by most of the Greeks, to be spiritual. I think they rather were intended to adhere to some sort of ethnography. But again, once you leave Hecataeus, you find that all the Greco-Roman sources had an agenda, right? And their agenda was, in fact, at times a very negative one, right? He comes, Tacitus, who describes how Moses comes and founded Jerusalem, has no love whatsoever for Jews. He, in fact, says that they are diametrically opposed to everything. Moses founded a religion, according to Tacitus, that is diametrically opposed to everything that we Romans stand for. The line in Tacitus is, everything that we consider to be sacred, they consider to be profane, and vice versa. They care only about their own kind and have no love for anyone else. People that, he has a description of how people suddenly are no longer loyal to the laws of the land. And they are no longer loyal to their families or to the emperor. And they suddenly embrace a loyalty out to some other place. And of course, he's referring to the temple and so on, to the Jewish temple. In other words, he has no love whatsoever. And Moses, as I say, other than Hecataeus, and maybe Strabo, most of the Greeks and Romans describe the foundation of Jerusalem, but put it in rather negative terms. I don't think there was an attempt to spiritualize. And again, when we talk about Hecataeus, the big question is that a Greek source or is it in fact a Jewish source? I could have read Hecataeus and just have you enjoying his stories about how wonderful the Jews are. He tells a wonderful story in another text about how smart they are. Alexander the Great is on one of his expeditions in this part of the world, and there's a Jewish cohort within his army, and within that cohort there is a Jewish archer, right? A wonderful bowman, right? An archer. And this Jew, his name is Mozolamos, Meshulam, sees the army advancing, retreating, and he doesn't know what's going on here, and so he asks somebody what's happening, and he's told that there are seers within the army. These are some sort of magicians who are advising Alexander whether to advance or to retreat based on the flight of birds that they see in the heavens. And if the birds fly in that direction, they advance. If they fly in another direction, they retreat, right? And Mesollam, without saying another word, takes out one of his arrows, right, aims at the bird, shoots it down, and kills it. And they all start heaping curses on him. What have you done? Now they don't know where to march, right? And he says, how can any wisdom come from this bird? If this bird had any pre-knowledge of where to go, he would not have flown to this spot only to be shot down by the arrow of Mozolamos, right? Now, whoever told that story clearly has a pro-Jewish prejudice, as it were. And what the person was trying to say is that within a sea of what? Of superstition, right? And foolishness, here's this one Jew whose arrow shoots straight and gets to the core of things. So I got to be honest with you, Hecataeus is suspect. He's too good, right? There are one or two other sources that actually refer to Jerusalem and also talk about the Jews have a unique city. They call it Jerusalem and so on. but the fact is that most of the Jerusalem stories, as I say, have a negative bent to them when you read these Greco-Roman materials. So I wouldn't take that too far. Yes, please. That doesn't become very apparent. When you read what he knows in terms of deity, right? I mean, we could say that the story says one God appeared to him, whether he knew what else he was doing there at the time. And again, you realize the implication of what you're saying. He only knew one God, and it was to that one God that he did not adhere, right? So the one commandment he got, he didn't keep, right? I think what the rabbis were doing is something that became very, very fashionable in the Second Temple period and in rabbinic times, and this is what I would call a rabbinization of the past. In other words, the idea being that, and this is interesting, I once wrote a little article about this. In Christianity, you have this sense of an advancement, and there's a word that is often bandied around, supersession, right? The Christian church has taken over for old Israel, but there's a sense of spiritualization, of advancement. We're on a higher level than our predecessors, right? Our predecessors believed in an earthly Jerusalem. We know there's a heavenly Jerusalem, a spiritual Jerusalem, and the laws of the practical laws of the Bible have now been superseded by more spiritual laws. So you may not have to circumcise because the orla can be, the foreskin is really the foreskin of one's heart, right? Or lat levavchem, rather than the real foreskin, and so on and so forth. Christianity basically says we've reached a higher level. When you get to rabbinic self-identity, you find that they can't take that path, right? On the one hand, they do believe that there is a spiritualizing process. We are now a nation of Torah, right? And even after the destruction, we're going to talk about this in a few weeks, after the destruction of the Second Temple and Yochanan ben Zakkai and Yavne, and there's a sense we found a solution that might even be preferable to the earlier existence of Jews, and so on. The world of Torah, of the rabbis, even being better than the high priest that preceded them. By the way, they say that in as many words, right? And yet they could never claim that they are at a higher level than the forefathers. And so the only solution was to do what? Was to, as it were, reflect back upon the fathers a rabbinization process. Meaning, if we are proper and the ultimate solution to Judaism, well then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob must have been doing this also. Because there's no way that we can be superior to them. And once you begin this process of what I call rabbinization, then it's clear what was the last thing that Jacob was doing before Joseph was taken from him. They were studying Torah, and they were learning the laws of Eglah Arufah, and Joseph sends back an Egel, right, to remind his father what they were studying. So they were studying Torah even before the Torah was given, and I can go on and on with examples of this, right? But this is a process. So I think in that sense, they were able to do the same with Adam, right? They were ultimately able to say Adam kept mitzvot. And as I said, the rabbis did not invent this idea. This already appears in the book of Jubilees, and it's already established in the book of Jubilees, this idea that what we see today already existed way back when. Once you do that, the prehistory of Jerusalem becomes clear, right? What you see in Jerusalem today already existed in its own way before Kings David and Solomon established Jerusalem as the capital city. And so we've dealt with what I can almost call a mythic prehistory of Jerusalem. Beginning next week, I'll be on firmer ground, right? And we'll be able to talk about the Jerusalem that most of us recognize within a historical framework. Thank you.